There is a particular kind of mind that moves through the world differently. Not better, not worse, simply different. These minds perceive layers that others miss. They sense emotional currents before anyone speaks. They track patterns invisible to most. They feel the weight of unspoken things. And the strangest part is that deep thinkers rarely recognize their own depth. They assume everyone notices what they notice. But they don't. And this gap between perception and expectation creates an entire psychological universe that is both extraordinary and profoundly isolating. Understanding the psychology of deep thinkers is not about placing them on a pedestal. It is about finally naming the inner mechanics that shape the way they experience reality, relate to others, and navigate a world that often feels too shallow for their consciousness. Deep thinkers typically begin life with a subtle sense of being out of rhythm with the world around them. Not dysfunctional, not broken, just different. While most minds navigate reality through information, facts, data, surface-level details, deep thinkers navigate through patterns, meaning, and emotional undercurrents. They notice micro-expressions before words are spoken. They sense contradictions instantly. They perceive hidden motives without trying to. They observe first and react later. And this gap between observation and reaction becomes their greatest asset and their heaviest burden. Because in a world built on speed, surface-level connection, and rapid consumption, deep thinkers move through depth. And depth does not rush. What most people never realize is that deep thinkers live with a constant background process running inside their minds at all times. It is always analyzing, connecting, refining, and decoding reality, even in silence, especially in silence. The mind of a deep thinker is never truly still. It is simply quiet on the outside. This inner processing creates extraordinary insights, intuitive accuracy, creative brilliance, and philosophical clarity. But it also creates overthinking, emotional exhaustion, internalized pressure to understand everything, and a sense of carrying more than others seem to carry. There is a moment, often early in life, where a deep thinker realizes that sensing more means carrying more. And the mind begins developing strategies, sometimes healthy, sometimes protective, to handle the weight. One of those strategies is isolation, but not the kind most people imagine. Deep thinkers do not isolate because they dislike people. They isolate because most interactions feel shallow, repetitive, or energetically noisy. Small talk feels like being trapped in a room where nothing meaningful can breathe. Surface-level conversations feel like emotional static. Forced cheerfulness feels like a lie. And so deep thinkers retreat, not out of arrogance or superiority, but out of self-preservation. They need environments where the mind can breathe, where silence is honored, where depth is not considered too much. Most of them grow up feeling guilty for this need, as if requiring solitude means something is fundamentally wrong with them. But solitude is not avoidance. It is recalibration. It is the deep thinker's way of processing, integrating, and returning to equilibrium. However, here is where things become even more interesting. Deep thinkers experience emotions differently than most people. They do not feel things lightly or casually. They feel them fully, completely, even when trying not to. Their emotional system is wired for intensity, not because they are dramatic, but because their perception of reality is layered and multidimensional. A simple interaction can trigger reflection across multiple psychological levels simultaneously. A minor conflict can activate a full internal analysis of motives, meanings, and implications. A single sentence can spark an existential question that echoes for days. This emotional depth is not a flaw or a weakness. It is capacity. But capacity without understanding becomes overwhelm. And overwhelm without support becomes isolation. Deep thinkers also carry a rare and often misunderstood trait. They know things without knowing how they know them. Their intuition is not mystical or magical. It is the result of thousands of micro-observations happening instantly, below conscious awareness. The subconscious gathers data from tone, body language, energy, context, and subtle signals. The conscious mind receives the conclusion, and the deep thinker simply feels the truth. People around them often deny this accuracy, dismiss it as coincidence, or feel threatened by it. But eventually, reality proves them right. And when this happens repeatedly, when their intuition is validated again and again, Deep thinkers begin to rely more on inner signals than external voices, not out of stubbornness or arrogance, but because their inner world has been tested and validated countless times. But here is the paradox that defines the deep thinker's inner world. They can read other people with remarkable accuracy, yet struggle profoundly to understand themselves. Their mind analyzes the world with surgical precision, but their own emotional world remains a mystery. Why does this happen? Because deep thinkers understand patterns better than they understand feelings. They can decode behavior, but have difficulty naming their own needs. They can sense emotional storms in others, but ignore or minimize the storms inside themselves. They can offer profound insight to others while remaining blind to their own blind spots. This creates an internal conflict, an external genius with internal blind spots. And this conflict silently shapes their relationships, their decisions, their self-perception, and their entire life trajectory. There is also something crucial about the psychology of deep thinkers that must be named. They are extremely sensitive to inconsistency. Not emotionally sensitive in a fragile way, psychologically sensitive in a penetrating way. They detect contradiction instantly. They sense hypocrisy before it becomes visible. They feel manipulation before it fully unfolds. Their mind scans everything for coherence, alignment, and truth. And when something does not align, when the surface does not match the depths, they feel a sudden inner shift, a tightening, a sense that something is not matching its presentation. Most people ignore this feeling or push it away. Deep thinkers cannot. Their mind will not allow unfinished puzzles to exist. This is why they seek truth, not comfort. This is why they ask hard questions. This is why they cannot pretend or perform for long. However, this truth-seeking nature often leads them into profound misunderstanding. People interpret deep questions as criticism. They interpret curiosity as confrontation. They interpret reflection as distance or judgment. They interpret silence as rejection. And so deep thinkers often learn, early and painfully, to hide their depth to avoid overwhelming others or creating conflict. They become selective about where they reveal their full capacity. They code switch between their public mind and their real mind. They simplify their thoughts to fit into conversations. They smile when they want to question. They stay silent when they want to speak. And this creates emotional fatigue because living with two versions of a mind, one for the world and one for the self, is exhausting. It is like running two operating systems simultaneously, and neither one ever gets to rest. There is a moment in every deep thinker's life when they begin asking a painful question: why do I feel so disconnected from most people? But the disconnection is not personal or pathological. It is perceptual. Deep thinkers process reality at a different bandwidth than most. They are not above others. They are tuned differently. And tuning is not superiority. It is simply wiring. It is the way their nervous system was built. It is the way their mind naturally operates. And instead of accepting this difference, most deep thinkers spend years trying to change themselves to fit into a world that was not designed for the way they think. To understand the psychology of deep thinkers, something else must be named clearly: their internal timeline. Deep thinkers process things slowly and quickly at the same time. Quickly in comprehension, the mind grasps concepts instantly. Slowly in expression, the emotional system needs time to catch up, to integrate, to find the right words. This is why deep thinkers often appear distant when overwhelmed or quiet when thinking deeply. Silence is not avoidance, it is integration. Stillness is not rejection, it is processing. And the longer they are silent, the more profound the work happening inside. Here is a moment where a deeper truth emerges. Deep thinkers rarely feel truly understood. Not because they are impossibly complex, but because they rarely communicate the full depth of what they see and feel. They speak in simplified versions of their real thoughts, because expressing everything would take too long, require too much context, or overwhelm the listener. They filter themselves constantly. They translate their inner world into digestible pieces. And this self-filtering creates the illusion that they are private, reserved, or emotionally distant. But they are not private. They are compressed. They are not distant. They are protecting. And the cost of this protection is a chronic sense of loneliness, even in the presence of others. At this point, a question arises naturally. What happens when deep thinkers suppress their depth for too long? The answer is internal collapse. The mind becomes overloaded with unprocessed insights. The emotions become heavy with unexpressed truths. The spirit becomes restless with unlived authenticity. Deep thinkers require expression the way plants require sunlight. Without it, they wither internally. Not visibly, not dramatically, quietly. They become depressed, not because something is wrong, but because they have abandoned themselves. They become anxious, not because the world is dangerous, but because they are not being heard. They become disconnected, not because they do not care, but because caring without being understood feels pointless. Another core trait of deep thinkers is hyperperception. They notice inconsistencies in tone, micro shifts in energy, changes in facial expression, pauses in conversation, the way someone's shoulders tense, the way their eyes look away. They see the subtext behind words. They feel intentions behind actions. They sense what is not being said. This hyperperception is powerful. It makes them excellent therapists, counselors, artists, and leaders. But it is also exhausting. The mind is always receiving emotional signals, even when the thinker wants peace. They absorb atmospheres like sponges. They sense tension without being told. They pick up on others' emotions and sometimes cannot distinguish between what is theirs and what belongs to someone else. And this constant inflow of information requires solitude for processing and integration. Yet despite all this capacity and sensitivity, deep thinkers struggle deeply with one fundamental thing: asking for help. Not because they believe they don't need it, but because they feel responsible for handling everything internally. Their independence is not confidence, it is self-protection. Relying on others feels risky. Sharing too much feels unsafe. Showing vulnerability feels like handing someone the blueprint to their inner world. And most deep thinkers have been misunderstood or judged for their depth, so they learn to safeguard it fiercely. They become their own therapist, their own counselor, their own support system. And while this builds resilience, it also builds walls. Now something essential needs to be explored: the silent emotional burdens deep thinkers carry. They often feel responsible for holding emotional balance in relationships. They anticipate problems before others see them. They prevent conflicts before they start. They mediate tension without acknowledgement. They absorb others' emotions to protect them. They become the emotional anchor in unstable situations. And because their emotional intelligence is advanced, people assume they are always fine, always strong, always capable. But deep thinkers feel deeply, even when they hide it flawlessly. And the weight of this hidden feeling accumulates over time. Here is the practical framework that every deep thinker needs to understand themselves: the 3 layers of internal processing. This framework explains how their mind works and why they experience reality so differently from others. Layer 1 is immediate perception. This is the instant recognition of patterns, emotional signals, inconsistencies, contradictions, or deeper meanings. It happens before the conscious mind becomes aware of it. Deep thinkers do not choose this layer. It is automatic. The nervous system scans the environment and delivers conclusions instantly. Someone walks into a room and the deep thinker knows immediately if there is tension, if someone is lying, if the energy is off. This layer operates at the speed of intuition. Layer 2 is internal analysis. This is the mind building connections, interpreting symbolic meaning, evaluating multiple perspectives, considering implications, and refining understanding. It is the most active layer and the reason deep thinkers need silence and solitude. The conscious mind is working, questioning, exploring, integrating. This layer is where overthinking happens, where insights emerge, where creative breakthroughs occur. This layer is where the deep thinker's real work happens, and it requires time, space, and mental energy. Layer 3 is external expression. This is the final, simplified version of their thought, the version others hear. But this expression is only 20% of everything happening internally. The other 80% remains unspoken. The deep thinker has filtered, translated, simplified, and compressed their full inner experience into words that others can understand. And in doing this compression, something essential is always lost. When deep thinkers understand this internal structure, clarity emerges. They stop believing something is wrong with them. They stop shrinking their depth to fit into others' comfort. They stop apologizing for needing space. They stop forcing themselves into environments that drain them. They stop judging themselves for being different. And most importantly, they begin honoring the way their mind naturally operates. They recognize that their depth is not a burden to be hidden. It is a gift to be expressed. Deep thinkers also experience relationships differently than most people. They form connections slowly but profoundly. They seek emotional resonance, not entertainment. They value meaning over novelty. They need authenticity over performance. And once they bond with someone, the connection is layered, intuitive, and remarkably resilient. They are loyal not because of obligation, but because their emotional architecture does not allow shallow attachment. They cannot pretend to care. They cannot simulate interest. Everything is either real or empty. And this makes them rare partners, rare friends, rare colleagues. People who will show up fully or not at all. But this depth creates vulnerability. Deep thinkers can idealize people, seeing potential instead of present reality. They can stay in situations long after they should leave, hoping for understanding or growth that never comes. They can carry emotional weight alone, believing they are strong enough to handle it. They can lose themselves in introspection, forgetting that life also requires participation and action. They can become so focused on understanding others that they neglect their own needs. And they can become so committed to truth that they forget the power of compassion and acceptance. Yet despite every challenge, every burden, every misunderstanding, deep thinkers possess something rare and powerful: inner sovereignty. When they trust their inner world, their clarity becomes unshakable. When they follow intuition instead of external pressure, their path becomes aligned. When they honor their depth instead of hiding it, they attract relationships that can hold it. When they stop apologizing for the way they think and feel, something extraordinary happens. The mind becomes a sanctuary instead of a battlefield. The depth becomes a gift instead of a curse. And the isolation transforms into solitude, which is isolation chosen rather than imposed. The invitation for every deep thinker is clear. Stop trying to fit into a world designed for shallow minds. Stop believing your depth is too much. Stop hiding your perception. Stop apologizing for your sensitivity. Stop carrying the weight alone. Your mind is not broken. It is simply wired for depth. And the world needs deep thinkers now more than ever. People who can see through illusion, who can sense truth, who can hold complexity, who can feel the emotional reality beneath the surface. Your depth is not your burden. It is your purpose. If this message resonates deeply, if you recognize yourself in these words, consider subscribing to this channel to continue exploring the psychology of consciousness, awareness, and the extraordinary minds that perceive reality differently. Like this video if it brought recognition or clarity about your own inner world. Share it with someone who needs to know they are not alone in their depth. And in the comments, share your experience. What part of the deep thinker's psychology felt most true to your own inner life? What have you discovered about the way your mind naturally works? The conversation continues below, and every voice matters in this community of awakening minds.